What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
The President of the United States.
These United States are confronted with an economic affliction of great proportions.
America may be headed for a recession.
And I must say to you that the state of the union is not good.
Our trade deficit is too large.
Part of our trouble is that we have been self-indulgent, and now the bill has come due.
Unless we act forcefully, and now, the economy will get worse.
But I pledge to you tonight that the full powers of this government will be used to keep America's economy producing.
What we need is spending discipline in Washington, D.C.
And thus restore balance to our economy.
We will continue along the path toward a balanced budget.
Once it's balanced, we will start paying off the national debt.
And now we are on course for budget surpluses for the next 25 years.
A strong nation and economy requires more than a balanced budget.
Only a true partnership between government and the people can ever hope to reach these goals.
We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow.
We must solve problems, not leave them to future generations.
We won't leave it to our children and our grandchildren.
We must not go back to unwise spending.
We must strive to break the calamitous cycle and help dispel the uncertainty that so many feel about our economy.
And tonight, that cause goes on. God bless.
Our war for independence created much of our early debt, and by March 4th, 1789, the first day of our federal government, our national debt was $75 million, which was about 40% of our economy. This terrified our founding fathers, and they acted quickly to pay it down. We didn't stay there for long. The Civil War not only had a huge human cost, it brought the United States to the brink of bankruptcy. However, like before, we paid our debt down quickly. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created to help manage the nation's money supply and to oversee national banks. That year was also the birth of the modern income tax. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Several years later, the Great Depression brought with it extreme economic hardship for millions of Americans.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens.
It is insurance that you and your employer have bought and paid for.
World War II was a time of sacrifice, and while the government took on unprecedented levels of debt, Americans bought savings bonds to finance our winning the war.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Humphrey Bogart.
Our fighting men have just won history's greatest victory for freedom. Buy bonds for their future and for your own future.
We've got another bond to buy.
It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
The large military and social spending practices of the 1960s and 70s were two key factors that led to a major economic downturn by the end of the 1970s. The 1980s saw the rise of supply-side economics.
It's morning again in America.
Reaganomics.
You're the trickle-down theory guy.
I'm betting my reputation on it.
The controversial Laffer curve proposed that lower marginal tax rates would eventually generate higher tax revenues. The theory did have its critics.
Let me just give you a difference that I have with Governor Reagan on taxes. It is what I call a voodoo economic policy.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
Read my lips.
The debate over supply-side economics continues to this day. But what is not debatable is that the federal debt exploded in the 1980s. A fundamental shift had occurred. America was becoming addicted to debt. Never before in our history had so much debt been created during an era of relative peace and prosperity. Yes, the Cold War ended, but it came at an extremely high price, and people from across the political spectrum were becoming very alarmed.
(1775). The American Revolutionary War began as the American colonies sought to detach from England and its oppressive monarchy. Though many reasons are cited for the revolution, one in particular sticks out as the prime cause: that King George III of England outlawed the interest-free, independent currency the colonies were producing and using for themselves, in turn forcing them to borrow money from the Central Bank of England at interest, immediately putting the colonies into debt. And, as Benjamin Franklin later wrote, the refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the revolution. In 1783, America won its independence from England. However, its battle against the central bank concept and the corrupt, greed-filled men associated with it had just begun. So what is a central bank? A central bank is an institution that produces the currency of an entire nation. Based on historical precedent, two specific powers are inherent in central banking practice: the control of interest rates and the control of the money supply, or inflation. The central bank does not simply supply a government's economy with money, it loans it to them at interest. Then, through the use of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank regulates the value of the currency being issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system can only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out. For every single dollar produced by the central bank is loaned at interest. That means every single dollar produced is actually the dollar plus a certain percent of debt based on that dollar. And since the central bank has the monopoly over the production of the currency for the entire country, and they loan each dollar out with immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the central bank again, which means the central bank has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system without fail is slavery, for it is impossible for the government and thus the public to ever come out of the self-generating debt. The founding fathers of this country were well aware of this. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems, which were swindled into place by ruthless banking interests. At this time, the dominant families in the banking and business world were the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds. And in the early 1900s, they sought to push once again legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So, J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by publishing rumors that a prominent bank in New York was insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would cause mass hysteria, which would affect other banks as well. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together a few years later, Frederick Allen of Life magazine wrote, "The Morgan interests took advantage to precipitate the panic, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed." Unaware of the fraud, the Panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the banking cartels and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission, led by Aldrich, recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark the international bankers needed to initiate their plan. In 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge that the 10 or so figures who attended disguised their names when en route to the island. After this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. Later, Woodrow Wilson wrote, in regret, Congressman Louis McFadden also expressed the truth after the passage of the bill. A world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers, acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. The Fed has usurped the government. Now, the public was told that the Federal Reserve System was an economic stabilizer, and inflation and economic crises were a thing of the past. Well, as history has shown, nothing is further from the truth. The fact is, the international bankers now had a streamlined machine to expand their personal ambitions. For example, from 1914 to 1919, the Fed increased the money supply by nearly 100%, resulting in extensive loans to small banks and the public. Then, in 1920, the Fed called in mass percentages of the outstanding money supply, thus resulting in the supporting banks having to call in huge numbers of loans, and just like 1907, bank runs, bankruptcy, and collapse occurred. Over 5,400 competitive banks outside of the Federal Reserve System collapsed, further consolidating the monopoly of a small group of international bankers. Privy to this crime, Congressman Lindbergh stepped up and said in 1921, "Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first scientifically created one, worked out as we figure a mathematical equation." However, the panic of 1920 was just a warm-up. From 1921 to 1929, the Fed again increased the money supply, resulting once again in extensive loans to the public and banks. There was also a fairly new type of loan called a margin loan in the stock market. Very simply, the margin loan allowed an investor to put down only 10% of a stock's price, with the other 90% being loaned through the broker. In other words, a person could own $1,000 worth of stock with only $100 down. This method was very popular in the roaring 1920s, as everyone seemed to be making money in the market. However, there was a catch to this loan. It could be called in at any time and had to be paid within 24 hours. This is termed a margin call, and the typical result of a margin call is the selling of the stock purchased with the loan. So, a few months before October in 1929, J.D. Rockefeller, Bernard Baruch, and other insiders quietly exited the market, and on October 24, 1929, the New York financiers who furnished the margin loans started calling them in masse. This sparked an instantaneous, massive sell-off in the market, for everyone had to cover the margin loans. It then triggered mass bank runs for the same reason, in turn collapsing over 16,000 banks, enabling the conspiring international bankers to not only buy up rival banks at a discount, but to also buy up whole corporations at pennies on the dollar. It was the greatest robbery in American history. But that didn't stop there. Rather than expanding the money supply in order to recover from this economic collapse, the Fed actually contracted it, fueling one of the largest depressions in history. Once again outraged, Congressman Louis McFadden, a longtime opponent of the banking cartels, began bringing impeachment proceedings against the Federal Reserve Board, saying of the crash and depression, it was a carefully contrived occurrence. International bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair so that they might emerge the rulers of us all. Not surprisingly, and after 2 previous assassination attempts, McFadden was poisoned at a banquet before he could push for the impeachment. Now, having reduced the society to squalor, the Federal Reserve bankers decided that the gold standard should be removed. In order to do this, they needed to acquire the remaining gold in the system. So, under the pretense of helping to end the Depression, came the 1933 gold seizure. Under the threat of imprisonment for 10 years, everyone in America was required to turn in all gold bullion to the Treasury, essentially robbing the public of what little wealth they had left. And at the end of 1933, the gold standard was abolished. If you look at a dollar bill from before 1933, it says it is redeemable in gold. You look at a dollar bill today, it says it is legal tender, which means it is backed by absolutely nothing. It is worthless paper. The only thing that gives our money value is how much of it is in circulation. Therefore, the power to regulate the money supply is also the power to regulate its value, which is also the power to bring entire economies and societies to its knees. It's important to clearly understand the Federal Reserve is a private corporation. It is about as Federal Express. It makes its own policies and is under virtually no regulation by the U.S. government. It is a private bank that loans all the currency at interest to the government, completely consistent with the fraudulent central banking model that the country sought to escape from when it declared independence in the American Revolutionary War. Now, going back to 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was not the only unconstitutional bill pushed through Congress. They also pushed the federal income tax. It's worthwhile to point out that the American public's ignorance towards the federal income tax is a testament to how dumbed down and oblivious the American population really is. First of all, the federal income tax is completely unconstitutional, as it is a direct, unapportioned tax. All direct taxes have to be apportioned to be legal based on the Constitution. Secondly, the required number of states in order to ratify the amendment to allow the income tax was never met, and this has even been cited in modern court cases. Third, at the present day, roughly 25% of the average worker's income is taken via this tax. And guess where that money goes? It goes to pay the interest on the currency being produced by the fraudulent Federal Reserve Bank, a system that does not have to exist at all. The money you make working almost 3 months out of the year goes almost literally into the pockets of the international bankers who own the private Federal Reserve Bank. And fourth, even with the fraudulent government claim as to the legality of the income tax, there is literally no statute, no law in existence that requires you to pay this tax, period.
The more money you have relative to the amount of goods, the more inflation you have, and that's not good. So
we're not a free market then? There is an invisible, there's a benevolent hand that touches us.
Absolutely. You're quite correct. To the extent that there is a central bank governing the amount of money in the system, that is not a free market, and most people call it regulation.
And so when you lower the interest rate and drive money to the stocks, that lowers the return people get on savings
yes,
in a bank.
Indeed, yes, indeed.
So they've made a choice. We would like to favor those who invest in the stock market and not those who invest in a bank. That helps us.
No, that's the way it comes out, but that's not the way they think about it.
This is about Bernanke. This is about Bernanke. He has to be on that call. Forget the investors. The investors are going to do. If Bernanke listens, Bernanke needs to open the discount window. That's how bad things are out there. Bernanke needs to focus on this. Alan Greenspan told everyone to take a teaser rate and then raise the rate 17 times. And Bernanke is being an academic. It is no time to be an academic. Listen, open the darn Fed window. He has no idea how bad it is out there. He has no idea. He has no idea.
Kramer.
I have talked to the heads of almost every single one of these firms in the last 72 hours, and he has no idea what it's like out there. None! My people have been in this game for 25 years, and they are losing their jobs, and these firms are going to go out of business, and he's nuts! They're nuts! They know nothing!
The Federal Reserve seeks solely to get as high a level of real material well-being as we can by setting a platform of stability. We cannot pick and choose amongst various areas of the population because we just have no means of doing that. If fiscal policy is lax or savings are exceptionally low, there is nothing monetary policy or any central bank can do about that. We cannot live in the present only. Human beings cannot survive unless they create provision for the future.
In 2007, China had the largest trade surplus in the world. And who was dead last? The United States of America.
I've always liked business, I've always liked investments, I've always liked economics, but I'm a disaster. If you ask me, what happens to a split atom or what happens to a cell within a body. So different people are wired different ways. A few years ago, I wrote an article for Fortune on sort of the parable of Squandersville and Thriftsville, which was designed to simplify for people problems inherent in persistent and large trade imbalances. Economics tends to put people to sleep, and I thought maybe by creating a couple of islands with inhabitants of quite widely different activities that it might get across a point that otherwise they get lost on. The thrust is that if you own a lot of property, an island in this case, you can trade it off for the things that you eat and consume every day, and you can do that for a long time, but eventually you run out of property and then you have to work a whole lot harder to provide your own needs, but also to pay back for the debt you've incurred. Short-term actions have long-term consequences that sometimes people don't think about in the short run. In the last few decades, but accentuating in the last 6 or 8 years, this country has started consuming considerably more than it produces. Because we're so rich, we can do it for a long time, and we can do it on a large scale, but we can't do it forever. Eventually you run out. I mean, it's like a credit card. My credit's pretty good at the moment, and if I want to go out and quit working and have no income coming in but keep spending, I can, first of all, sell off the assets I have, and then after that I can start borrowing on my credit card, and if I've got a good reputation, I can do that for quite a while. But at some point I max out, and at that point I have to start producing a whole lot more than I consume in order to clean up my debts. In this country, we have seen imports increase from 5% of GDP to, 17% or so of GDP in the last 35 or so years, and yet we have 4.5% unemployment, and we have a very, very prosperous country. So it's a good thing for us. What is not good is the imbalance between imports and exports. The rest of the world is buying more and more of our goods all the time, but at an even greater rate, we're buying more and more of theirs. That's not good. More trade overall is good as long as it's true trade. If it's pseudo-trade, where we're buying but not selling, I do not think that's good over time.
If you're buying more than you're selling, which is what a trade deficit is, eventually your trading partners are going to own a lot of your wealth. When they are not buying your goods and services with this money, they will be looking for ways to invest it. Running large and persistent trade imbalances can be problematic, especially when a country has a low savings rate and its government needs to borrow more money every year to pay its bills. In the fall of 1956, the world was on the brink of a major international conflict. America's allies, Britain and France, were engaged in a battle against Egypt over control of the Suez Canal. The Soviet Union was threatening to intervene on the side of Egypt. America wanted to avoid military action at any cost and demanded that the British and French allies withdraw from the region. When their request was denied, the U.S. turned to financial warfare. America, which at that time owned much of England's debt, threatened to sell off or dump a significant part of its holdings in the British pound.
So, as far as going into any kind of military action under present conditions, of course we're not.
This would have effectively destroyed England's currency. The result? All British and French military forces withdrew from the Suez region within weeks. Some historians consider this the exact moment that the British Empire ceased to exist.
Do you think there's a risk of a recession? How do you rate that?
You know, you need to talk to economists. I think I got a B in Econ 101. I got an A, however, in keeping taxes low and being fiscally responsible with the people's money. States and our allies have prevailed.
You've never been once in the target range. You know, if I set my targets and I perform like that as a physician, my patient would die.
Is the gentleman finished? Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Paul. Mr. Watts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are U.S. Treasury bonds still safe to invest in?
Very much so. I think this is not an issue of credit rating. The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default.
But very quickly, if you could answer another question, because I'm curious about this. You know, the price of gold today is $1,580. The dollar during these last 3 years was devalued almost 50%. When you wake up in the morning, do you care about the price of gold?
Well, I pay attention to the price of gold, but I think it reflects a lot of things. It reflects global uncertainties. I think the reason people hold gold is as a protection against what we call tail risk, really, really bad outcomes. And to the extent that the last few years have made people more worried about the potential of a major crisis, then they have gold as a protection.
Do you think gold is money?
No.
It's not money. Even if it had been money for 6,000 years, somebody reversed that and eliminated that economic law.
Well, it's an asset. I mean, it's the same. Would you say Treasury bills are money? I don't think they're money either, but they're a financial asset.
Why do central banks hold it?
Well, it's a form of reserves.
Why don't they hold diamonds?
Well, it's tradition, long-term tradition.
Well, some people still think it's money.
It's an interesting question.
But do you think that gold is currently a good investment given what you're saying about the potential for turmoil?
Yes.
Do you put...
Yeah, I mean, economists are usually perfect in equivocating. In this case, I didn't equivocate. Look, remember what we're looking at. Gold is a currency. It is still, by all evidences, the premier currency where no fiat currency, including the dollar, can match it. And so that the issue is, if you're looking at a question of turmoil, you will find, as we always have in the past, it moves into the gold price. But the gold price is actually sort of half a commodity price. So when the economy is weakening, it goes down like copper. But it's also got a monetary characteristic which is intrinsic. It's not inbred into human beings. I cannot conceive of any mechanism by which you could say that, but it behaves as though it is. Intrinsic currencies like gold and silver, for example, are acceptable without a third-party guarantee. And I mean, for example, at the end of World War II, or just at the end of it, Germany could not import goods without payment in gold. The person who shipped the goods in would accept the gold and didn't care if there's any credit standard associated with it. That is a very rare phenomenon. It's the reason why, for example, in a renewal of an agreement that the central banks have made, European central banks, I believe, about allocating their gold sales, which occurred when gold prices were falling down, that has been renewed this year with a statement that gold serves a very important place in monetary reserves. And the question is, why do central banks put money into an asset which has no rate of return, but cost of storage and insurance and everything else like that? Why are they doing that? If you look at the data, with a very few exceptions, all of the developed countries have gold reserves. Why?
Well, I imagine right now it's because of a question mark hanging over the value of fiat currency or the credibility going forward.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. Every time you get some really serious question, the 50% of the gold price determination begins to move.
Right.
And I think it is fascinating. And I don't know, is Ben Steele in the audience?
Yes.
There he is, okay. Before you read my book, go read Ben's book. The reason is you'll find it fascinating on exactly this issue, because here you had the ultimate test at the Mount Washington Hotel in 1944 of the real intellectual debate between those who wanted an international fiat currency, which was embodied in John Maynard Keynes' construct of a bancor, and he was there in 1944, holding forth with all of his prestige, but couldn't counter the fact that the United States dollar was convertible into gold, and that was the major draw. Everyone wanted America's gold, and I think that Ben really described that in extraordinarily useful terms as far as I can see. Anyway, thank you.
Right. Well, I'm sure with comments like that, that will be turning you into a rock star amongst the gold bug community.
Surprising to me that it's gotten essentially no mainstream media coverage at all, because we're talking about so much money.
The Federal Reserve is the black hole in American democracy.
All we have to say is, what do they have to hide?
The Federal Reserve had a responsibility to provide oversight for the conduct of banks. They didn't do that.
It's known as one of the most powerful and secretive institutions in Washington. And now, President Obama wants to hand the Federal Reserve even more power.
I am proposing that the Federal Reserve be granted new authority and accountability for regulating bank holding companies and other large firms that pose a risk to the entire economy in the event of failure.
The president's plan to make the Fed the systemic risk regulator has raised eyebrows on Capitol Hill.
The president's financial reform proposal has included broad and sweeping increases in Chairman Bernanke or his successor's powers. And if that power is used, what will be the oversight?
I believe that we have to adequately audit the Federal Reserve before any consideration is given to making the Federal Reserve the systemic risk regulator.
My concern about the legislation is that if the GAO is auditing not only the operational aspects of our programs and the details of the programs, but is making judgments about our policy decisions, that would effectively be a takeover of monetary policy by the Congress, a repudiation of the independence of the Federal Reserve, which would be highly destructive to the stability of the financial system, the dollar, and our national economic situation.
Despite these dire warnings against having an audit, Fed challengers in Congress aren't flinching.
This is a situation where the Federal Reserve is out of control. Since September, it's been doing things it never did before in its history.
With the help of a rule from the days of Woodrow Wilson that gave the Federal Reserve vast authority to lend money during unusual and exigent circumstances, the Fed has doled out more than $1 trillion to financial institutions without consulting Congress. When freshman Congressman Alan Grayson asked the Fed's Inspector General how much of that money the Federal Reserve had lost since the crisis began, he was surprised to find out she didn't know.
So are you telling me that nobody at the Federal Reserve is keeping track on a regular basis of the losses that it incurs on what is now a $2 trillion portfolio?
Until we actually look at the program and have the information, we are not in a position to say whether there are losses or to respond in any other way.
And I think it was shocking to me and to other people to see that the Inspector General could not account for $1 trillion of cash that had been handed out by the Federal Reserve in the course of just the past few months.
The fact is that the American people want to know more of the secrets of the temple, as the book was before you were born. The Secrets of the Temple. It was required reading in my day.
Nancy Pelosi said the public wants to know more about the secrets of the temple. And my response to that is, if the public does learn more, they will be outraged more.
Journalist and author William Greider says the Fed's darkest secrets are conflicts of interest stemming from its deep ties to the financial elite.
The Federal Reserve, from its origins, is very, very close to the biggest banks and financial houses in the country. Always has been and always has governed with that in mind.
The Fed has refused to release the names of all the banks it's given money to, but some of the names that have leaked out have caused concern. And as stories emerge of how the banks got their money, some are questioning the Fed's close relationship with Wall Street.
One example that I think is particularly dubious, Jamie Dimon, CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, is involved in the bailout of Bear Stearns. If that firm failed, one of the people who loses first is J.P. Morgan Chase. So he is also saved by the bailout of Bear Stearns. So he graciously agrees to take over Bear Stearns if the Federal Reserve will put up $30 billion to cover his losses. What I find troubling is that Jamie Dimon sits on the board of directors of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Tim Geithner, who was then president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank and is now Treasury Secretary, was bargaining with his own board member on this terms of this deal. So I think what's happened in this crisis is that people all over the country have been able to see there's something illegitimate about this. They may not be able to put their finger on it, but this doesn't feel right. And some people are getting downright angry, and that includes a lot of members of Congress.
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth?
And now one House committee is holding its own investigation into the controversial deal that the Fed brokered between Bank of America and the failing financial giant Merrill Lynch. According to documents acquired during the investigation, Fed Chairman Bernanke threatened to fire Bank of America CEO Ken Lewis, when Lewis considered backing out of the deal.
The Fed's decision-making process in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch merger makes the case for a significant increase in accountability at the Fed.
The next hurdle for the plan to audit the Fed is the House Financial Services Committee, chaired by Barney Frank. Although Frank has praised the Fed's work to keep credit flowing during the economic crisis, he's pledged to include a Fed audit in the major financial regulation bill he plans to finish this summer.
There will be substantially increased auditing. We don't want anything that would endanger the integrity of monetary policy. But in general, the operations of the Fed, the money they take in, all of that will be very much subject to audit.
Despite the momentum, the Fed's not quitting the fight. It just created a new position for Enron's former head lobbyist, Linda Robertson, to push back against congressional critics.
I think it's unfortunate that they're struggling so hard to keep this secret. We need to know exactly who got the money, what the terms are, all the details of this, because this is a democracy. Can't hand out $1 trillion of the people's money and keep everyone in the dark about it. That's ridiculous. Nobody has that kind of power in a democracy in a constitutional country.